everyone. Welcome to Comfort and Growth, the podcast for people who are passionate about personal growth and productivity. And I'm super excited because today I have with me my OG German psychologist, don't listen, Greg, my inspiration and my original personal growth mentor, the man who introduced me to this world of personal growth and inspired me to leave my life of finance and pivot towards a career of helping people unlock their potential. I have with me today Volker Krohn. Hi, Volker.
Hi, Crystal. I'm so glad that I've been able to actually get you involved into the personal growth. It's one of my better things I did in life.
Thank you. Yes, we have gotten up to all kinds of trouble together over the years, Volker. For decades, we have biked down the mountains of Bhutan.
That's right, yes.
We have meditated
together.
Yes.
Almost levitated.
I thought I levitated. I'm not sure about you, you know.
Well, I'm very grounded, yes.
And Volker is here today to share with us some of his best advice from teaching more than how many people have you taught?
Goes into the thousands. I've been basically working probably over 40 years as a psychotherapist.
40 years as a psychotherapist. So we have a wealth of wisdom in the room. And I personally started off sitting at Volker's feet literally for years. I did, Volker. We would run these retreats and I would literally sit at his feet and marvel at his morsels of wisdom. And I learned so much from you about how to navigate difficult conversations, how to hold space for others, when to push people and to be provocative, and when to know that you had to give them a little space, and most importantly, when to shut up.
That's true, but I do think it's probably the student having outdone the master. So done, you know. So.
Anyway, this is a love fest over here. But so Volker is the director of the Hoffman Process Asia Pacific. Is that right, Volker?
Correct, yes.
Yes, and that Hoffman Process, can you explain what it is in a sentence?
Well, it's one of the oldest personal growth movements really on the planet. It's been around for over 50 years, and it's been conducted in about 15 different countries. And I'm also one of the directors of Hoffman International. So I'm sitting on the board, and it's probably also one of the only personal growth programs that's been scientifically researched independently by the University of California.
So we're definitely going to hear more about this later, but I want to start off with a very broad intro, which is when I first met you, I was an investment banker. I didn't know anything about personal growth or inner work and that sort of stuff. And my first introduction to this was at the Hoffman Process. And I heard you kept on saying you've got to do the work. You got to do the work. And I was like, I'm working. I'm already working. What do you mean when you say the work? So could you explain for those of us who may be like me, not understanding what is personal growth? What does it mean to do inner work? What does that mean?
Okay. Well, it's quite a large question on one level, but let me try to make it simple. So, and I think probably doing inner work sometimes might be also a little bit an unfortunate term of words. So on one level, it's really personal inquiry. And as some wise man once said, if we don't start talking to ourselves, we'll end up doing nothing but. So it's important to develop an inner dialogue. And I've been using for many years now this concept of what we call the quadrinity, but it refers to 4 different aspects of the self. So where there's the emotional self that represents our feelings, then there's the intellectual self that represents our thought patterns, then there's obviously our physical self, the body, and we also have the notion of the witness position, or you can call it the essence, or just pure consciousness. Some people even refer to it as a spirit, the spiritual self. But I think it doesn't really matter what kind of names or labels you want to put on it. But I think the inner work really that is required these days. I mean, there's lots of people who've also gone on a religious or meditative path that actually encountered more trying to become present. But what I also figured out that a lot of the time, particularly in our first world countries, we have a lot of people have a lot of inner conflict. And it's usually the conflict between thinking and feeling.
Right.
Right. And particularly in Singapore, where there's a lot of emphasis being put on achievement and getting ahead in life, having a particular reputation and so forth. So there's a lot of pressure, internal pressure that people have on themselves, where their intellect talks to their own emotional self and say, look, you got to do better, or you only be approved of if you have certain achievements. You got to make sure that you have your KPIs and make sure that your boss doesn't recognize that you may be slack. So it creates enormous amount of anxiety internally.
So that's like the tyranny of the inner critic.
And a lot of people actually, when you ask them, how do you feel? They say, oh, good or bad.
Normal.
Okay.
Nothing.
Yes. Nothing. Neutral. And we need to actually develop the vocabulary that more adequately, more sophisticatedly can actually describe our inner world of feelings.
Right. So doing the work involves like opening up consciousness or awareness of our four aspects of self, mind, emotions, body, and spirit. And now you're going into the importance of developing emotional literacy.
That's correct. And so you could call that's the inner work. But for most people, there is actually that inner conflict between thinking and feeling.
Yes.
So where I spoke about, you mentioned it, the inner critic, there's also the inner pusher as well, which is probably an aspect of the intellect as well. Now, there's usually an emotional response in us when and a lot of people are not that conscious of. So if we have a very critical intellect and a pushy intellect saying, you got to do more, you got to do better, and you got to look better. This is not the right kind of attire you're wearing. I have to lose weight and all of that.
My hair.
So internal, we start to actually then, our emotional self starts to feel I'm inadequate.
Right.
I'm maybe not good enough, or maybe I'm dumb or stupid or unlovable. And a lot of us don't want to be present to those kind of feelings because they're a lot of the time intolerable because we had so much experience during our upbringing at school, etc. Constantly, this is an unwanted experience. So our intellects come in and saying we try to shut down these feelings.
Yeah.
And that's not really the solution.
So it's like when your inner critic gets too much, then the emotional self feels like, oh, I'm not good enough and I'm deficient. And then I start feeling shame or, the emotions that come up are kind of more difficult emotions. And then what happens is then that emotional self gets exiled in a way.
Yeah, well, for some people. Some people also, and it varies from probably personality type to personality type. There are some people who get really emotionally activated. They are full of emotional drama.
Right.
And their intellect almost is a bit recessive.
Right.
So they haven't got the cognition to actually say, look, just because somebody took your right of way in traffic doesn't mean that you need to kill that person.
Right.
So, but the emotional child has such a huge response, and we then get, no good la, we have to do something about it. I don't like them. Singapore drivers are the worst. And
right. Emotional hijack.
Emotional hijack.
Yeah. So it's that balance between your cognitive, self and also your emotional child.
Correct. And on one level, that's probably what the inner work is about. And in order for those two to actually, these two aspects that at times are fighting, we need to probably excavate what are the trigger points on an emotional level. And for some people, they particularly at work, there's an enormous amount of trigger points speaking to our superiors.
Yes.
Right. So authority is a big trigger point.
Triggers
for many.
fear and inadequacy and all these feelings.
That's right. So sometimes can also be having to talk to our subordinates. Right. So where we also feel some people feel so over responsible that they can't upset another person.
Yes.
They feel emotionally over responsible and feeling, okay, I cannot give clear feedback here, or I don't know how to deliver that somebody hasn't really completed what they agreed to do. And so that also then becomes an awkwardness. So people then in their behaviors then shut down.
So like basically when people at work feel like they're avoiding certain difficult situations, it's almost always because there is some sort of kind of emotional conflict in there, isn't there?
Yes, or there are usually past experiences.
Yeah.
And let's face it. I mean, I come from a perspective that as children, we're basically born in a state of unconditional lovingness. When we first, as an infant, look at our environment, we are completely open to exploration. We look at our parents, and our father could look like Quasimodo, the hunchback of Notre Dame, and we still think, wow, what a wonderful, handsome man he is.
Yes.
So we are unconditional, and because we haven't really developed a discerning intellect yet.
Yes.
So, and somehow, as we grow older, we seem to lose sight of our essential lovability. And I think that's what a lot of inner work is about, is actually helping people to come back, to recognize that they're actually okay the way they are.
I remember one of the most powerful meditations that you guide in the Hoffman process is a light journey. And as part of the light journey, you always repeat these 3 sentences. You are loved, you are loving, and you are lovable. And I remember the first time you said it, you said you are loved. I was like, yeah, I know I'm loved. And then you said, you're loving. And I'm like, yes, I can see I'm loving. Then you said, you're lovable. And when you said that, I just cried. I don't know where it came from, but that was like the first time that I kind of got grokked. I kind of like got the size of like my issues were a lot to do with really, at some level, not finding myself that lovable.
Yeah, and look, let's face it, it's good to be able to talk about it. Most people don't even have the courage or even the ability to actually recognize that.
Yes.
That fundamental, sometimes we feel a little unlovable.
Of course.
And yet that's probably the yearning and the longing in every human being. We want to be beloved, and we want to be seen as lovable. And so a lot of the time there's been distortions that have occurred where we feel I only will be lovable if I'm the achiever.
Yes.
Or
if I do this, then I will be lovable. Or if I show up this way, if I achieve this, then I'll be lovable. And I think I struggled a lot with that. You remember Volker?
Yeah. Look, and it's partially also societal. It's partially in our educational system.
And Asian culture.
And Asian culture. Look, German culture, it's just very similar like that.
That's why we get along. Must achieve.
We must achieve, and it needs to be perfect, right?
Yes, and on time, on target.
And on time, on target, So, and there's a lot of good aspects about it, you know. So it's not to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yes.
But it's also recognizing that the baby actually feels unlovable. And we need to learn how to regulate that emotion as it gets triggered. And the only way how we can actually do that is by helping people to have a corrective experience where they can come back to an experience within themselves where they actually realize, yes, I am actually lovable. And if there's tears, if that's been triggered, and if you're triggered in your tears when that statement is being heard, that actually that's where the healing starts to occur.
Yeah, I think that's so true. It's like sometimes when you start crying out of nowhere, it is like that's the, like, you know what Leonard Cohen said, that's the crack. That's where the light gets in.
Yes.
Yes. So what I'm summarizing is, so inner work, we've got the 4 aspects of self. It's about knowing that there's 4 aspects of you and not just the mind. It's about developing that emotional literacy and being able to, in a way, love yourself and give yourself that love that most of us spend looking for in the outside world.
Yes, it's a very good summary. Maybe what I could also add to it, and I think that's sometimes really good to and we brought it up a bit earlier, it's the inner conflict.
Yes.
Where if we really truly analyze it, and some people are so stuck in that inner conflict,
Yes.
so they think I should maybe tell my boss X, Y, or Z. The intellect says, don't do it, you'll get into trouble. The emotional child feels really fearful and also upset, might get a little bit of resentment, and the intellect, don't say anything because you get into trouble. Then you go and talk to your coworker, what a terrible person that boss is, and so you start to have gossip occurring, which basically more comes out of resentment. So it's not supportive gossip, which sometimes can be a good way of actually sharing information about the community.
Supportive gossip. You heard it here first. That's a new one.
Well, there is an element about it.
Yes,
If it's
yes.
in families, we have to talk about what the auntie does,
Yes.
and we share information about the cousin,
Yes.
and it gives us an experience of family
Yes.
togetherness, and that's
Sorry for
appropriate.
derailing you, Walker.
But there's malicious gossip, and
Yes.
that's what I was referring
Yes.
to. And that actually starts to then destroy team alignment, for example. And
yes.
and so that inner conflict, however, if we analyze it, we're either in the past,
Yep.
he didn't acknowledge me, or we're in the future, I don't know how to actually talk to this person. It's not going to be good. So, and in that moment, we actually lose presence.
Yes.
So our attention is too consumed in that inner conflict between thinking and feeling. And so that is what I actually really see what inner work is, or the inner self-inquiry
Yes.
is, and finding resolution is to come back to a place where we can listen to these different aspects, but also come to a place of peace with an
Equanimity.
equanimity. And in that moment, automatically, presence will descend.
Yes, and I think it's such an important point because a lot of times people talk about mindfulness, which is the ability to be in the present and not, be lost in the past or jump forward into the future. But I felt that the Hoffman process, when I did it, it was a different approach to mindfulness. Yes, there was this being in the present, but it was also the being able to find coherence in like unpacking in the present moment. I am thinking this and I am feeling this. And it's being able to kind of like, as you say, unpack the inner dialogue. And sometimes I think hold these parts of ourselves not with a sense of I need to solve this and I need to decide which one is better or which one wins, but being able to recognize that we are bigger than like just our mind and just our feelings. But as you say, an important part is also the spiritual self, which is like the big you, and being able to zoom out and actually see from a bird's eye view all these different aspects of ourselves.
Correct. And I think that zooming out and using in that sense spirituality or mindfulness, that it's an emotional resource.
Yeah.
To be able to not get overwhelmed by some of the hurt or that lives in our emotional self.
Yes.
Or also to be able to distance ourselves when
Yes.
we have a vicious intellect attack, right?
Yes.
So where we realize, where we can actually label it and say, I'm fearful, or I'm actually giving myself a really hard time, or I'm feeling unlovable. Even in the statement of it,
Yes.
research has shown is
Yes.
that in that moment, the limbic
Prefrontal cortex.
language center, it reduces really the innervation of the amygdala in that
Yes.
moment, and by almost 40%. So
It's called name and tame.
Name
The
and
moment
tame.
we name and label our emotions with specificity and granularity, the moment instead of just going like, ugh, I feel so, ugh, and the moment we are able to say, Volker, when you said that, I felt a little bit of disappointment and also mixed with that, some shame.
yeah, or some inadequacy or
Yes.
something like that. And that moment, it doesn't become overwhelming.
Yes.
In that moment, we are, as you said, we name it, we tame it. We are able in that moment to zoom out from the overwhelmingness of some of those triggers.
Yes, beautiful. So I want to move on to another question, which I get a lot. So as you know, like we all have a personality, a way that we see the world, and which all the strengths and weaknesses. And some people often ask, how much of this is nature? How much of this is nurture? And how much of it is like inherited from, our parents? What is your view on this?
Well, it's what is genetics? There's obviously epigenetics. The latest explorations around epigenetics really look at how environmental pressure really also change our genome to some extent, whether it's switching it on or switching it off.
Yes.
So probably the scientific understanding of it is more that it is obviously both. There's nature, but there is also environmental pressures that will have an impact on us.
Yes.
And so conditioning, also childhood conditioning, is a really important part. On one level, all our consciousness, the way we learn to drive a bicycle, for example, we have to make mistakes. We fall down. We then, after a while, we have to basically balance, pedal, steer, all of that, look left, look right, and all of that. So it becomes very high intensity until eventually you master it. It becomes unconscious mastery. So
Yes.
we've created a learning pattern within ourselves where we can all of a sudden still talk on the phone or listen to music.
Yes.
I wouldn't advise to actually text while driving.
Safety bear.
Safety first. So, but that's actually happens with all our experiences.
Yes.
So, and as I mentioned to you before, as a child, we really require that unconditional attention from our caregivers. So, and they need to function in a particular manner. So, the way I see it, that as a child, we need caregivers that recognize when we're, for example, sad. So they reflect that back to us. Oh, you look a little sad. Maybe you need a cuddle. So later in life, we learn it's okay for me to make myself vulnerable, and I trust that my environment will respond to me appropriately.
Yeah. So what you're talking about is, in a perfect world, if I was sad, mommy would come along and say, "Oh, you look sad." And then I would know it's okay for little Crystal to be sad. And I recognize the truth of my experience. But oftentimes, especially in an Asian culture, I'll look sad. And then mommy will come along and say, "What have you got to look sad about? I'll give you something to feel sad about."
Sounds like Germany as well.
yeah. Exactly. But then, it may be done with, good intentions to guide us. But oftentimes parents are not really mirroring empathically like what our truth is. And then when I grew up, I started not actually knowing how I felt.
Yes. So a lot of the time, that's when we then constantly look outside ourselves and see, oh, well, I need to get the clues from my environment in order to then change my feelings so they'll be happy.
Yes. So instead of me actually having a direct experience of sadness, I will then look at my mother's face and I'll see, what does mother want of me? And then I will then give her the kind of simulation of what that is that she's looking for. And that's the story of how Crystal became a people pleaser.
Yeah, for example, So
Yes.
And obviously our caregivers there's also more granularity the way
Yes.
they have to function.
Yes.
I don't know whether we have enough space and time to go into it. But I think what's also really important to what I want to say as well, that as children, we also at times need to be able to feel safe enough to also challenge our caregivers.
Yes.
When we perceive them to do something unjustly
Right.
or unfairly, right? It's not necessary that the child always has to guess its way, but where
Yes.
we feel it's okay for me to have a conversation about it, where I say, look, Dad, I feel it's unfair that my sister's getting an ice cream and I don't get an ice cream.
Right.
So, and where then Dad needed to basically say, look, there's some reason you can't have ice cream today because you've already had one earlier.
Right.
So, but at least we have that conversation. So we learn
Yes.
later on in life that I can actually confront an interpersonal issue with somebody.
I
and
can
it doesn't.
express myself.
I can express myself and I can trust that it doesn't necessarily mean the end of the relationship, but we actually developing a greater level of intimacy
Yes.
with one another, right?
Absolutely.
So if we're not being taught that at an early stage, so our consciousness then gets formed that I have to be always the nice person, or I have to avoid confrontation,
Yes.
or I have to always supply other people with what they want, for example. So otherwise, I will not be loved. I will
Right.
be rejected.
Yes.
And so that forms then what we call a pattern. A pattern is basically a reaction to a situation. And the way I define a situation is something that's observable, phenomenologically observable. Like if you were to put a CCTV camera on it, you'd be able to recognize, there's Crystal and Volker sitting here in blue chairs opposite each other with a microphone in front of them. That's
A situation.
a situation. A pattern would then be,
I don't like Volker's shirt.
I don't like, exactly, you know, so, or he should have really shaved a bit better today, or
So
something like that.
The pattern in that case would be judgment or criticism.
That's exactly right. So, and there's an emotional charge in that, right? So, and you see millions of situations every day,
Yes.
and we have all our different emotions, sometimes stronger emotional reactions, and other times we don't.
Yes, so like same situation can happen. For example, I've noticed that I can say something to my team, and 10 different people can take the same situation, same words, and interpret it and go into 10 different patterns about that same sentence.
Yeah, you can say to somebody, hello, and a person will say, oh, well, they didn't call hello Volker or or hello Crystal.
Yes.
Or somebody will see it, they're trying to come onto me, you know,
Yeah,
so
yes,
they're
exactly.
making advanced. So we do not really know how other people really perceive us.
Yes.
And their reactivity is their reactivity.
Yes.
So what we're coming from, that other people might trigger me. My emotional reactivity to it is always 100% my responsibility.
Right.
In that moment, I actually start to take charge of my life. I actually become a leader of my life, right? Rather than actually going, I wish my wife would be different, or my boss should be different. Then I wouldn't have to feel inadequate. Why do they put so much work on top of my desk all the time? And I go into, I feel wronged. And so that's more a position of being a victim.
It's kind of like separating what is factually, happening with your interpretation. And also, but it's not to say that like you need to take responsibility for everything, right?
No, that could be another pattern, you know,
Yes.
and some people have that as well. So where
Yes.
they feel they're responsible for the whole, for everybody. I call it grandiose over responsibility.
Yes.
For example, if you've had a critical parent,
Yes, me.
Yes.
I have. Don't watch this, Mom.
Gertrude, yes, don't watch this either. Anyhow, so if you had a critical mother, so we internalize that pattern. And then we have 5 different ways how we can act it out in our current life experience.
Okay, so this is important. I want you guys to pay attention because this really changed my life. There are 5 ways in which patterns can actually go from like our authority figures and then trickle down to impact us.
Yeah, so the first one is where we do it to ourselves.
Yes.
So I become very self-critical.
So mommy was critical, and the first one is that then I do it to myself. I become critical just like mom.
Yeah, so I have this internalized parental voice sitting, like in our intellect, we're saying, look, you haven't done this right, and you've got a crease in your shirt, and so you become highly critical within yourself.
So you carry around mommy's voice wherever you go. We're not trying to blame moms here. It's just an example. Okay?
Yeah.
Mothers are great.
Yeah, they've done their best. Like
Yes.
I'm a parent myself, you're a parent as well.
Yes, of course.
And so as a parent, there's no such thing as perfect parenting.
Yes.
There's only good enough parenting.
Yes, absolutely. That's something that helped me so much in my journey. Okay, so number 1 is adoption. Mom was critical, and I do it to myself.
Yeah. Second option is you do it to others. So you come across the way mom was, for example, or dad, right?
Yeah.
So you also start to criticize and you look at other people more through that lens of criticality. So you don't necessarily see them, this is just a beautiful lounge chair. No, you see, there's a crease there. So your attention is being driven to the fly in the soup.
Yes, absolutely. The glass half empty.
The glass half empty. So, and that's where we're looking always, then if we're stuck in this pattern, always to what's right or what's wrong.
Right. So number 2 is I do it to others.
Yeah.
Yep. Number 3.
The third one is a very interesting one. So we set others up to do it back to us.
Right. How does that work?
So, for example, it can either be through through behaviors. If you constantly make agreements to meet at a particular time and you'll show up late, of course, even if the person is not necessarily very critical, but after a while they might get annoyed and you get some critical feedback on that.
So
behavior.
you make them critical.
You make
so
them
mom
critical.
was critical, and how I can do this is I can behave in a way that makes other people treat me with criticism just the same way mom used to.
Yeah, that's basically we're so used to that on one level. The other option on that one is also it can be a projection. For example, when we become self-conscious, right? In that moment, we project onto our environment that they all look upon us with a critical eye.
So we project mom everywhere. Everywhere I go, everywhere I see,
I see mommy.
and mommy sees me.
Yes. Or dad.
Or
Right?
dad,
Yeah.
or daddy.
Right. So that's also really an important recognition. For example, I have certain clients, or I even saw it with them myself. You have a little hole in your sock or a smudge on your pants, and you think everybody will notice it.
Right,
Most people are not interested in it.
right.
Or most people are so involved in their own thinking and feeling.
Not everyone's your mom.
Not everybody.
Remove your mother from other people.
That's exactly right.
Yes.
So that's the third option. The fourth option is we call it rebellion. It's like the psychodynamic term would be a reaction formation, where you say, I don't want to be like my mom.
Yep.
I don't want to be so critical, so I'll have that criticality within myself, but I try to put effort into not doing it. So I bite my tongue, even if I may sometimes have to say give some people a critical feedback, but I refuse to do it.
So mom used to criticize me. I hated it. So I am never going to criticize anyone and be a doormat and let other people walk over me, even when I have valid reasons to criticize others.
Correct. The other option is also, we call it a reaction. So where if you've been surrounded by a very highly critical parent,
Right.
you may also then move into becoming a perfectionist.
Right.
So you take on perfectionism as a modum operandi.
Yes.
Or it could also be the opposite, where you just try to become the fly on the wall, where you don't do anything, where you basically go into a state of total avoidance because you just only try to avoid not to be criticized.
So in that way, it's almost as if you are anticipating this criticism and then you form this protective sort of barrier to inoculate yourself against this.
Yeah, and that's what I said before. In that moment, we actually live in the hurtful past.
Yes.
So we're not actually in this present moment. This is another brand new day here,
Yes.
so we're constantly recreating internally the history that we haven't really worked through.
Yeah. And this is really interesting. I'm going to overshare a story now that Greg's out of the room. Okay, so when we first got together, there was this thing that Greg did that was, yawning. And every time he would yawn, I would get so irrationally furious at Greg, even though logically I knew that a yawn's just a yawn. But I would get really furious. And then when I went deeper to unpack, do the work and understand where it's coming from. And I remember talking to you about it, and you guided me into to think when was that first childhood memory I have of a yawn or feeling that way. And then I realized that when I was young, my dad used to yawn a lot to cut off me and my brothers from conversation.
Yes.
And in that moment when my dad yawned, when I would be so excited, I'd be sharing something at school that I would be excited about, and then he would be and to me, I interpreted that as you don't deserve the attention, or you're not important,
Or you're boring.
or you're boring. Yes, you're boring. And therefore, even though Greg's not my dad, every time Greg yawned, I became furious because I thought he was kind of saying to me, Crystal, you're boring.
Yes. Oh, terrible. Yeah.
Death. I would rather be anything but boring.
Yeah, so that's how patterns work. And you
Yes.
can also play it out with all sorts of other patterns as well. For example, if somebody has had a parent that was more withdrawn emotionally, so you can, or unavailable. So you do it to yourself, you become unavailable and you withdraw from your own emotional content.
Yeah.
You do it to others, so you're unavailable and withdraw from other people.
Yes.
Or you set people up to do it back to you. So you
Yes.
invite people into your life who are a bit emotionally shut down, who are who are unavailable
You
to
marry
you.
your dad.
You marry your dad, for example, or you go.
I mean, not literally, but you look for people who are like that and kind of,
yeah. Or you could go also then in rebellion. I feel I have to always make myself available. I can never actually make it create a boundary. And if anybody wants something, I will be always available because I don't want to do that. What maybe a parent may have done to me, or you're basically. Somebody who's just has to be constantly
yeah.
available to all sorts of shenanigans
Yes.
that are around, So you can. That's another way of looking at it.
Yeah, so essentially, there's a lot of ways to F up your kids. But what do you always say about guilty but not to blame?
Yes, that's exactly right. So we have to recognize that there's cause and effect.
Yes.
And I think one of the main parts in what we said before, there's no such thing as perfect parenting.
Yes, absolutely.
All right, and so we need to develop actually some compassion.
Yes.
And the way to self-compassion, I think that's where it basically comes back down to.
Yes.
And I think there's a difference between self-esteem and self-compassion.
Yeah.
So self-esteem is very much reliant on what we achieve
Yes.
and our feedback that we get from our environment. Where self-compassion is where we are able to recognize when we are triggered, we recognize our own suffering, and we're able to regulate our own suffering
Yeah.
because we have internal strength. And that's really what really the work is about, is developing that level of self-awareness and also an inner an approach to oneself
Yes.
where we can actually bring compassion, to recognize that suffering is part of life.
And it's a bit like that paradox, like Zen Master Suzuki said, we are all perfect and we all could do with a little improvement.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, we have to live holding the balance of the opposites.
Yeah,
Right.
absolutely. So the $1 million question, how does the Hoffman process, which is the process I went through, the 5-day residential retreat,
6.5 days.
6.5-day residential retreat, how does that process, which you have dedicated your life to teaching, how does it actually help people lead a more successful, meaningful, and happy life?
That's a big question. So knowing that we are relatively time poor here, there are basically 4 different steps that we take people through. It starts off with a cognitive behavioral inquiry where you start to name what are actually my behaviors that create certain issues in my life. So people sometimes say that I suffer from depression or anxiety or have interpersonal difficulties or I'm not getting ahead in my job as well. So we help them to unpack what are actually the behaviors that drive those kind of life experiences.
The underlying behaviors that at the root of their negative life experiences.
Exactly, so it's about personal self-responsibility.
Yes.
So what is it that I do? So that's the first step, but we also then take it into that cognitive behavioral inquiry into tracing it back from which parent, which you've learned it from. So you can see it's learned behavior, and because it's learned, you can unlearn it. So that's the awareness step that people do before they actually arrive at the retreat. And at the retreat, because there's the old saying, if our intellects are so smart, how come we are not okay?
Yeah.
So we need to then also do the emotional work. And so we create a very safe environment where people can actually right the wrongs, where we call it expressive work, where they're able to take, first of all, responsibility. I'm now lumped with these patterns of criticality or unavailability. And however, we need to make a radical decision to not act like this.
Right.
And we use anger in that moment, because anger is the emotion with which we can right the wrongs.
Yeah.
And it's the emotion that helps us actually create psychic boundaries.
Yes, anger is a protective emotion that actually propels us into action.
Into action. It's the fire in the belly.
Yes.
We call it actually the battle for freedom.
Yes.
Right?
I
So
remember.
where we recognize in that moment that I'm not the patterns. I have these patterns, but I'm not the patterns. And it helps us in that, what we called before, that
Yes.
zooming out experience when we get triggered.
Yes, being able to say, dad or whoever this authority figure, when I was 8 years old and you did this, that was not okay. And then it's almost as if that's where the healing occurs, where we right the wrongs and then we learn from in that moment that it's okay for me to hold others accountable, because I couldn't do it back then with my dad, but I can now that I'm an adult, like learn that skill.
Yeah, and I just also want to emphasize so
Yes.
people don't have a misconception.
Yes.
We're not letting people say you need to confront your parents.
Yes.
No, you're dealing with the internalized
Yes.
parental voices here.
Yes.
So basically your own projection of,
Yes.
of the father authority
Yes. Yes.
that you keep in your own mind.
You're not actually going to dad or mom and saying, you're
No.
actually doing this work on your internalized belief systems, which may be influenced by them.
Yeah, exactly. You're dealing with your own subjectivity.
Yes.
So once that actually, and the experience at the end of it, we help people to go beyond the way anger was socialized in the context of their family. So I'll give you an example what I mean by that. As a child, when I was little, I had a mother that I sometimes used to describe her as the German version of Margaret Thatcher. So
The Iron Lady.
the Iron Lady.
Yes.
So anything I wanted to negotiate with her, I knew there was just no way I would be able to get my way with
Right.
her. So I learned and I got frustrated. And the more frustrated I got, the more there was definitely no way. So I
Yes.
learned very early to maybe become a bit deceptive.
Right.
So I would say, look, particularly when I wanted to go to the swimming pool, my mom
Yes.
hated me going to the swimming pool because I
Right.
probably got all sorts of diseases from there.
Oh, God.
Poor mom. Anyhow, so I would say to her, look, Mom, I just want to go and visit my friend Joe.
You're a little weasel. You
Yeah.
learn how to manipulate.
I knew how to manipulate. And I go and visit Joe, who happened to live next door to the swimming pool, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Connection.
But that will set up a pattern as well, in particularly also in relationships,
Yes.
where I would not speak my truth.
So your wife would ask you to do something and you might not agree with that, but then you...
I would do a little bit, but if she says, can you do the dishes? I would maybe do the dishes, but I would leave the soap suds in the sink, so just to
Yes.
get back a little bit. So,
Right.
So,
Interesting.
so what I needed to learn is to be able to speak my truth directly and not just, I would go when anybody triggered me in my anger, I would go immediately into thinking and strategizing. So I didn't have an immediate response in the moment to simply say this works and this doesn't work.
Yeah.
And so that's basically what we help people to do in the process.
Yeah.
And everybody has their own particular conditioning there, but that's why we call it really the battle for freedom, because in that moment you make a stand to what's actually authentic for you in your expression.
So how
of
would
your
that
life
sound
energy.
like? I want a specific example. So like Jeanette, your wife, says, oh, Volker, I would love it if you could, spend an hour massaging my feet. Should we give that example or not?
Yeah,
Like,
no,
what would
you can do that. Perfect
Or-
example.
okay.
I would say to her, sure, sweetheart, but I haven't got an hour. But I'd be happy to do it for 15 minutes. Is
Right.
that okay?
So that's healthy expression
Yeah.
of your boundaries.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
exactly right. you
And
know.
also your authenticity, where you're not like making some excuse like, oh, I've got a conference call and I need to do something. And
No, I personally I can't do it all. My head
head hurts.
My hand hurts.
I'm allergic to your foot cream.
So, something like that.
Yes,
exactly,
right, right.
So where you learn how to just be much more authentic and
yeah.
honest about
Yes.
what your own thinking and feeling is.
Right.
And learn how to trust that the other person is not going to be like mom, who then will come down like a ton of bricks
Yes.
if I have a slightly different viewpoint.
So like I think like the Hoffman experience is really one of coming home to yourself and learning how to express my needs in a responsible way and communicate my needs to other people, because no one's a psychic.
No.
But before the Hoffman, I kind of like was like, if you already know me, if you really love me, you would know. And then I would set all these little tests, and then if you fail them, it's like, oh, you know, I knew I couldn't trust you. But the Hoffman process taught me how to just be a lot more mature about saying, this is what I want, this is what turns me on, this is what turns me off, and you know, here's how I feel about it, and not feel ashamed that I had these opinions.
Yeah, and I think the other element, so after, first of all, this the awareness stuff, then comes the, what we call the expressive
Yes.
work, and we follow that up with compassion. And I think
Yes.
that is a really important crux, because we also have to, and we use their guided meditations, visualizations, and also journaling to help people shift perspective
Yes.
and reflect on what it must have been like for their parents when they were children.
Yes.
So they walk in their footsteps
Yes.
through their childhood.
Yes.
So they attune themselves to what was the socioeconomic environment in which they grew up. What was the
Yes.
historical environment?
Yes.
Particularly also here in Singapore, a lot of
Yes.
our parents, they
Third world.
it was abject poverty here.
Absolutely.
The Japanese occupation and
Yes.
all of that kind of stuff first, then the English
Yeah,
occupation
and I think it's a
beforehand.
super important point. So the process is not about blaming your parents. It's about also having compassion that they did what they did, knowing the best that they did with what they had back
Yes,
then.
so we attune ourselves to them when they were children, and so we start to actually see them, because we always thought my parents were always big and I was little.
Yeah.
So in that moment, when I did the program, I realized that they were also children.
Yeah.
And they also had their own vulnerability. My
Yes.
parents, they had to go through Nazi Germany. It was just
Yes.
awful, right?
Yes.
And had to witness enormous amount of war trauma.
Yes.
And understanding that was in my mother's system, it made more sense why she became so overprotective, right?
Yes.
And once you understand it, then that whole past experience doesn't trigger you anymore.
Yes.
And we work in that moment also on grief and sadness to help people be able to also basically tune themselves to the suffering that's been passed down from one
Yeah.
generation to the next.
Yes, instead of repressing it or suppressing, just, you know, letting ourselves have that sacred space to grieve and acknowledge that, yeah, as humans, we all have these suffering experiences.
Yeah, exactly. And for myself, it was a pivotal point in my life,
Yes.
really. So, because in that moment, I was able to be able to forgive. And when we can forgive for the perpetrator, so to speak.
Yes, you forgave your mom.
I forgave my mom, I forgave my father, who's unavailability. And in that moment, it changed my relationship to men.
Yes.
First of all, it changed my relationship to women.
Yeah.
And I was able to grow up emotionally. And I was able to experience equality with other people.
Yeah. That's
So I didn't have to go either become better than them or feeling worse than them. I was able to basically share our human journey.
Yeah. And then research on self-compassion shows that common humanity, that experience of oneness, and that, you know, is so important to being able to show ourselves compassion and others.
Yeah. And so that's probably it in a nutshell. The other part is probably important to recognize that it's not a quick fix.
Yes.
We need to then also develop practices and have tools afterwards in order to integrate those initiatory experiences.
Yes.
And I'm very much a believer of practices. It's
Yes.
just like you having to go to the gym, right?
Yeah.
So if you don't look after the body, it doesn't look so good and it doesn't work so well.
Yes.
So it's the same also with developing some techniques, some practices that really help us deepen our exploration.
Yes. And one thing important you told me is this metaphor of like the elevator lift buttons. You said, Crystal, you know, your family is always going to keep on pressing those buttons. They know the button, they know exactly which order to press them, beep, 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 like the nuclear code. But your job is to take off the panel and disconnect the wiring behind the buttons.
Yes.
So that when they are beep, 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 you're just like listening and you're looking at them.
It doesn't ring a bell
it
anymore.
Doesn't, it doesn't trigger you. So every single time at my Lim family dinners, I think I invoke Volker and I'm like, disconnect the wiring behind the Lim buttons. Well, Volker, you have shaped my life in so many ways you don't even know. I want to express how grateful I am. And, I want you to know that before I do any sort of big retreat, any sort of big teaching process, I always find a quiet moment and I tune in to you. I actually have this practice where I say to the universe, I say, please give me the strength and the wisdom. And I imagine myself connecting to that golden line of teachers, pass down all their wisdom. And I always feel that right behind me in that chain of teachers is you. And that you have my back. So
yes,
thank
I
you for being
always do.
a dear friend of mine.
Thanks, Crystal.
Yes. Love you so much.
Yes, and it's mutual.
Well, thank you so much for joining us for this episode on personal growth, doing the work, healing your inner child, and embracing all 4 aspects of yourself with our expert, Volker Kron. And if you want to find out more about the Hoffman process, we're going to link to the Hoffman's website in the show notes. And also, Volker, where can we get in touch with you?
Well, probably best is on our website,
Yes.
through our office. That's the best way of getting in touch with us.
And one thing that I really appreciate about the Hoffman process is that when I was a super skeptical investment banker and I wasn't sure whether it was right for me, you gave me a free consult. Do you still have this practice?
Yes, we do that.
Yes.
So people can also have free consultation. They take about an hour or something. So we go into a little bit of
private free consultation for anybody who's thinking of doing this sort of work. And you can make an appointment on the website with Volker's team.
Or give them a ring as well. So there's
Yes.
also a Singapore telephone number as well.
Yes, but they are all excellent. They are some of the most learned and, amazing facilitators that I know.
No, thank you. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, so we are. It's a privilege to be able to teach this kind of work.
Absolutely.
And we have some beautiful people who just really have dedicated their life to accompany people through that journey.
Thank you so much for coming, Volky.
Thanks, Crystal.
Lots of love. See you guys in the next episode. Bye. You can wave.
Bye.
Bye.